sure you want to know about it as well, right? So when you first run Cura, when you log into your account, I'll just talk like I'm talking to you. That makes it better for me. When you run Cura for the first time on your account, no matter what it is, so we've gone from 3.4 to 3.6, and then from 3.6 to 4.0. So in Cura 4.0, no matter what machine is starting it, if it's a new user, it'll always default to DeltaMaker S5. So the first thing that we want to do is manage our printers and add a new one. DeltaBots are under Other, and the school owns DeltaMakers, but DeltaBot and DeltaGo are the same G-code style, so it's okay that they're different. It's not the same brand. So we'll hit Add, and there it is. And we can actually remove the DeltaMaker because we don't have one of those. I just removed DeltaBot. That's okay. We can go through the process again. So that's how you add a DeltaMaker. And so we hit Activate for the DeltaMaker. So now that's our machine of choice. And you can see that it's gone from a rectangular build plate to a circular build plate. So in our machine settings, we're going to make our X, Y, and Z all 240 millimeters. The build size is actually 248 or something like that, but 240 is perfectly fine. We don't have a heated bed, it's just acrylic. I'm not going to mess with G-code or anything else. The extruder is actually a 0.4 instead of a 0.5, and everything else is perfect. We're going to hit Close. So under General Settings, that's okay. This is kind of your own flavor, whether you want to do more specific settings. I like to turn on Wall and Infill, and then I type in Z to find the Z-seam alignment. Sometimes for curvilinear objects, changing the actual the seam on the Z-axis will yield a better result on a curved surface because you can move it inside the print or around the edges where it'll give a better look, a finished product. So we'd use this button to open a print, so we're going to do that. I have, or an STL, excuse me. I have, a Ace Club logo. And so with Cura 4.0, we have the option to move, to scale, to rotate, to mirror. If I had multiple of these, I think it's Alt. No, I think you actually have to open up the file again. So if I had 2 of these or I had multiple different parts, you can select them individually, and with that button, you can change your settings per part, but that's only if you change that in your preferences. So it's an extra layer of complexity if you feel like tackling it. You can turn off supports, but there's also a setting for that over here, so it's just kind of a redundancy, I think. I always use custom settings instead of recommended, but again, that's dealer's choice. Your layer heights are going to vary between 0.2, 0.1, and 0.08. 0.08 is kind of like the cap. You can get 0.06, but you're going to have to change a whole bunch of other stuff in order to change. It's like V-Ray, where you change one thing and then you got to change like 60 things in order for everything to work. So I always stick with 0.1. You get perfect results with 0.1. 0.2 is just fine as well. Shell, although most of the models that we're doing are for display, I like to do 1 millimeter for top, bottom, and wall thickness and leave everything else fine. This is that Z-seam alignment. And so you can user specify shortest, random, or sharpest corner. I just go sharpest corner because it's going to be less obvious on a sharp edge. And since it's a rectilinear box, it's all squares, it doesn't matter anyway. But if I had a curved object, it would. Everything else is fine as far as shell goes. We can move on to infill. Your range will be between 10 and 30 to 40%. The Type A and the older versions of Cura use a millimeter for infill, but this uses a percentage based. You can change it to a millimeter, but I use percentage because it's easier. And I'm not machining the inside of the part to measure. I'm just machining the outside, so it's not a big deal. So infill density, I usually use 10 or 20 depending on the size. For this ACE block, let's change the scale, and instead of 76 millimeters, we'll make it 2 inches, so we'll type in 50 millimeters. So now it's a little bit smaller, and 10% infill is going to make this pretty brittle, so we'll change it to 15. Any of the infill types are just fine. There's the display in there that shows you the different aesthetics of all of them. They're all structurally fine. The only one that I'd steer people away from is concentric, because it provides no cross bracing. It's just horizontal or a vertical compression, no horizontal bracing. So I like Octet because it looks cool. So we're done with infill. The material, we can use 200 degrees Celsius. I like 230 because it melts a little bit more and it kind of gives a softer edge. It looks a little bit more smooth. And when you combine that with the layer height and the speed when we get to it, it'll yield pretty good results, like 99% of the time. I always enable retraction unless it's, I can't really even think of something off the top of my head that you would want to disable retraction. So we'll move on. Speed, for the Delta machines, I'd say 60 is probably the slowest you'd want to go. And these were the settings I was talking about earlier, infill versus wall speed. So if you have something that needs really detailed walls, you can put your infill at like 80, which is kind of the standard that I use. 60 is kind of the low end. 80 is just fine. And then the wall speed, I'd put at 60, and that's kind of my default. If I'm trying to get something done and I don't really care what it looks like on the outside, I'll usually set the print speed to 120 millimeters, the infill speed to 120, and the wall speed to 100. And you'll get a print, but it's gonna look rough, yeah. But you'll have it. So if you need it more than you need it to look good, I'd use that. I almost never use Z-hop when retracted. I haven't found an issue with it on versus with it off, so I just leave it off. It doesn't impact time as much either, really, in my experience. Cooling, I just let the machine call whether it needs cooling or not, so I'll just leave it checked. Support is kind of like the support for the old versions of Cura. I'm sure you are familiar with them, but I may as well go through it for the sake of the video. So if I had an object that looked like this, ideally it wouldn't, because I have these huge cantilevering faces. The way that we have it oriented by default, back this way, oops, if I rotated it correctly, is actually ideal because there's no overhanging parts, everything just comes up vertically. But if you can't fix it, or there's no way to get around it, you would want to generate support. And so for these large cantilevering pieces, we would generate the support. We would place the support everywhere. In this instance, because this cantilevering piece overhangs a piece of build, so it needs to go everywhere. And the overhang angle, I usually leave 50. Sometimes you can do 45. It's kind of dealer's choice, but 50 is like a pretty good default. That's kind of where I've found happiness. And so what that looks like, if we go down and hit slice, it'll prepare the file for us. And so that's what it'll look like. It'll create 2 boxes of support on these cantilevering edges. And then on these that make up the A, it'll also create support systems. And you can preview the layers with this scroller. You can see that it builds those supports right on top of the other part of the bottom piece of the E. So that's what that looks like, and we can go back to prepare. So that was support. I'll leave it turned off, and I'll fix the orientation of our object. If I clicked rotate, there we go. But that's an option if you have to cantilever something, you can't get around it. So I'll leave it turned off because we don't need it. Build plate adhesion, I almost always use brim. I've never been in a scenario where I thought, oh, I should use a raft. Perhaps if it's curved on the bottom, or if you're trying to print a circle or something that really doesn't have a flat face, I'd use raft, but I've never really run into a scenario where I needed it. Dual extrusion, we don't have a dual extruder, so we'll just leave it. That is everything. Those are kind of the defaults. I'll extend everything and go through it one more time, just kind of slow in case people don't want to rewind it. But those are kind of the defaults that I use, and everything else down here is kind of irrelevant. But that's kind of the default. Of course, point 2 is an option. We can hit preview to preview the model like I showed earlier, or we can just hit slice. It'll estimate a time, a gram, and a meter. And we can select save to removable device, which would be my flash drive, or back to file. I always just do to file, and then I would just save it to my flash drive wherever I feel like saving it. And then that would be it.